Liberalism section, The Pyramid of Peoples. This was a self-proclamation that was simultaneously an act of exclusion. It was not only colonial peoples who were affected by it. Even before the American Revolution, Franklin had established a hierarchy of nations on the basis of skin color, which claimed to classify the whole human race. Quote, all Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny. End quote. The same applied to pre-Columbian America. It was, quote, wholly so. The quantitative prevalence of peoples of color was evident. In a way, their presence even made itself felt in Europe. Quote, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion. End quote. The inhabitants of Germany did not come off much better. Representing the highest form of humanity were the English, settled on both shores of the Atlantic, quote, the principal body of white people, of purely white people, end quote, and the only community to embody the cause of liberty. The classical 17th and 18th century theme of the great chain of being becomes here the great chain of color, and it excluded the non-European peoples from the sacred space of civilization, relegating much of the West to its margins. If it rarely took such a naively naturalistic form, the pyramid dear to Franklin continued, in one shape or another, to be present in liberal culture. We find it again in Liber. At its apex, obviously, was the, quote, Anglican race, which fully expressed authentic liberty, while forming the base were the colonial peoples, not only the blacks, but also the Chinese. In the middle, we find jostling Spanish, Portuguese, and Neapolitans, who had hitherto proved incapable of elevating themselves to the principle of self-government. John Stuart Mill employed a language that was scarcely different. The apex continued to be composed of the, quote, Anglo-Saxons, to be precise, England and the United States, peerless champions of representative government and, quote, the general improvement of mankind. While at the base, in addition to more or less savage peoples, we find the Chinese. It is true that the latter could boast of a very ancient civilization. Yet, quote, they have become stationary, have remained so for thousands of years, and if they are ever to be farther improved, it must be by foreigners. End quote. Ireland could be assimilated to the other colonies or semi-colonies. Quote, half-civilized. In Bentham's view, Ireland, for Mill, was not only incapable of self-government, but also in need of, quote, good, stout despotism, exactly like in India, end quote. Not much better was the situation of Greece, situated as it was at the confines of Europe. It was still, quote, too oriental, in many respects, to be able to govern itself. Finally, at the center of the pyramid, we have the people of Southern Europe, whose, quote, inactivity and envy prevented the development of industrial society, the establishment of a strong ruling group, and the orderly functioning of institutions. By comparison with them, too, the Anglo-Saxons proved superior, free as they were of those characteristics, quote, submission, endurance, statism, typical of the French and, quote, continental nations, all of them rendered gangrenous by, quote, bureaucracy, and an envious craving for equality. Certainly the continental nations were not some homogeneous whole. With its geographical location close to Africa and an Arabic past behind it, Spain came out of things badly. In the list Mill drew up of, quote, envy, of grandeur and, quote, inactivity, its inhabitants came immediately after, quote, Orientals. Visiting Spain in 1836, at a time when it was plunged in a civil war, Richard Cobden, rather than taking sides with one of the parties, reached a general conclusion about, quote, barbarians beyond the Bay of Biscay. Spain was a nation of bigots, beggars, and cutthroats, with a government of whores and rogues. End quote. The Spanish of Latin America were not worth speaking about because, from the standpoint of the dominant ideology in the United States at any rate, they formed part of the colonial world. Finally, distinguishing themselves negatively in Senior's view were also the Neapolitans. Quote, I never saw so hateful a people. They looked as wicked as they are squalid and unhealthy. End quote. Moreover, no barrier separated the plebs from the upper classes. End of section.